Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Letícia Meirelles. I'm from Federal University of Minas Gerais. And today we will start another talk of Abralim ao Vivo series. Abralim ao Vivo is an initiative of Brazilian Linguistics Association and is designed to give students and researchers free access to state-of-the-art art discussions on the most diverse topics related to study of human language. Today, I'm here to introduce you Professor John Rivers from Texas University. He earned his PhD in linguistics from Stanford University in 2006, and he is interested on the nature of word meaning, focus on verbal semantics and the linguistic representation of events. Today, he's going to talk about how verbal roots can condition what alternations verbs occurring by a lecture named Applicativization and the Root Sensitivity in Argument Alternations. The handout of these lectures is available on Abralim's webpage, and as usual, at the end of the talk, we will have time for questions that should be asked by chat. So, thank you very much for your collaboration, Professor Beavers, and it's your turn now.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very, very much for having me. I'm very honored to be here, and thank you, Letícia and Miguel, for inviting me. I'm delighted to be able to have a chance to speak to all of you. I would say that two of the most fundamental questions in the study of verb meaning is the question of, first, what are the basic building blocks of a verb's meaning? How is a verb's meaning built up from more basic components into more complex meanings? And then second, how does a verb's meaning relate to its grammatical properties? What are the principles that put those two things together? And I think it's safe to say that in work in lexical semantics, argument alternations have formed one of the most core basic empirical domains where people have asked these questions. And an example of an argument alternation is the dative alternation, which I'll be focusing on in this talk, which is given in one. So we have something like Sandy sent Mary a book, and Sandy sent a book to Mary. We have a single verb that occurs in two different argument structures. The key difference is that the recipient here is either an indirect object or it's a 2PP. Okay. Now, within work on lexical semantics over the last several decades, there's been a lot of research that's coalesced around the idea that the nature of verb meaning consists at least partly of what's usually called an event structure, some kind of structured representation that constrains what kinds of events a given verb can describe. And this approach has been very successful, I think, in analyzing argument alternations. So on an event structural approach, the idea is that a verb's meaning can be broken down into two basic components. The first component is what's called an event template. This is some broad skeletal representation built from really basic, perhaps even universal notions like cause and become that tell us what the overall temporal and causal contours of the events being described are. Lots of verbs can share a template and they form verb classes. And then the template is supposedly responsible for most of the verb's grammatical properties like its argument structure. And then the second component is an idiosyncratic root that for a given verb indicates some special meaning specific just to that verb, some particular action or state that fills in some details of the template, distinguishing verbs that share a template from one another. The main morphological reflex of that, or grammatical reflex, is really just the idiosyncratic form of the verb. So argument alternations then follow very nicely from this analysis of verb meaning as one root that occurs in two templates. So for the dative alternation, this approach has been applied in many different ways. I'm going to give one example, which is Heidi Harley's 2003 analysis of dative alternations. She assumes that event structures are phrase structural objects built up from functional heads and acategorial roots, following traditions in distributed morphology. And the two alternations consist of, there's a causal head in both cases, a like verb in her case, that takes a state of complement. The difference is in the state of complement. For the indirect object frame, it's the projection of a have preposition that takes a recipient as its specifier and a patient as its complement. And then the to frame, you get a location, a be at type preposition that takes a patient as a specifier and then its complement is the location. So in a sense, then, the two state of heads take their arguments in the reverse order. basically. And that derives that there's an alternation in one. The job of the root here is simply to name the manner of the causation. So it's adjoined to the causal head and simply says how the causal relationship came about. So we get the same root in two different argument structures, and that gives us the alternation of one. It makes other predictions too. The fact that you have a possession type semantics in the indirect object frame, but not in the two frame, means that you can get goals in the two frame that aren't capable of possession. So you can say something like Sandy sent a letter to London, but indirect objects have to be capable of possession. So Sandy sent London a letter is semantically kind of weird. You really want London here to indicate, like a group of people, like it's the London office or the London government. Okay, so I'll call that the London office effect. There's also other things that follow from this analysis, especially the syntactified version of event structures. So it's well known since at least Bars and Lasnik 1986 that the first internal argument can bind asymmetrically into the second one, like a quantifier in the first one can bind a variable in the second one. That's shown in 4, but not conversely. And that follows because there's a C command asymmetry in the two alternations that differs in the two templates, where the first internal argument C command is the second. So that in principle provides an explanation for that. Okay. So there's a lot of power in this analysis. It's actually quite nice. You sort of have these templates and then you put different roots in different templates and you get different argument realization patterns. However, there's some well-known issues in argument realization that do cause some problems for this type of approach. The first issue is that even semantically very, very similar roots do not always occur in all of the same argument alternations. So for example, while mail and throw and send show both variants, verbs like carry only show the to variant and not the indirect object variant. And that's shown in 5b. It's weird to say Jim carried his friend a ball. It's not totally out, as Breslin and Nikitin showed. You can find instances of that, but it's something semantically odd about it. It requires a particular context. There's some incompatibility there. So how is a root controlling what alternations it occurs in? Second, the very meaning of the alternation itself can depend on the root. So, and this is something that Rappaport, Havave, and Levine called verb sensitivity. I'll call it root sensitivity here, since I'm looking at this through the lens of event structural approaches. So for example, the indirect object frame always gives rise to a London office effect. It doesn't matter what root occurs in, and that's shown in 6a. But it's not the case that you never get that effect in the two frame. It turns out you can, but it depends on the root. So for something like mail or send or throw, London is a perfectly fine 2PP, but not for give. Kim gave a book to London is just as anomalous as Kim gave London a book. Now, what that means then is that with verbs like give and also bequeath and loan, the alternation is actually synonymous. There's no truth conditional difference between the two variants, but there is with something like mail or send. So the very interpretation of one of the templates can depend on the root. It means the same as one template in another case, and it means something else in the other case. As you keep kind of going through, you see that there's increasingly more root-specific effects in the alternation. For example, you might expect from the analysis in 2 that you have to get possession at the end in one case, and you have to get arrival at the end in the other case. Turns out that's actually not the case. It is true for some roots. So if I say something like Kim gave John a book, but he never received it, that is contradictory. Give does require possession at the end. If Kim carried the ball to left field, but it never got there, that's also contradictory. You expect it to arrive at the end. Those are actually the exceptions. For most roots in the dative alternation, the templatic result of receiving or arriving is actually cancelable. There's no contradiction to say Kim mailed John a book, but it never arrived. Maybe it got lost in the mail. And similarly for most verbs that show the dative alternation. Okay. So it's the root that actually determines whether the template has a result state or not, another kind of root sensitivity effect. Interestingly, even when possession is cancelable, though, you still can get a London office effect. That means that the possession of the indirect object frame isn't actualized. Instead, it's what Gropin et al. Called prospective. It's just the possibility of possession that's encoded. We have other root sensitivity effects. Just to give one more example out of many that I could have chosen. Even though arrival and receiving are not entailed by most verbs in the dative alternation, some kind of loss by the agent typically is. It's weird to say Kim threw a ball to John, but it never left her hand. And similarly for a lot of other verbs, you expect at least that much change to occur, but not in all cases. So for example, the verb bequeath. doesn't require any transfer, any change, any loss. If you bequeath something to somebody, the only real result is that an obligation to later give has arisen. Okay. So what results are entailed are really root contingent. There are a number of other facts that go along with this, but this is just a taste of the notion of root sensitivity. A lot of the semantic action for alternation seems to be coming from the root and not the template. So the question is, what are roots doing and how are they related to templates that would explain this kind of variation under a theory where you're just sticking roots into different templates? There has, of course, been a lot of work that's kind of addressed this question, although there's been not much consistency in exactly how these effects are captured. Probably the most pervasive idea is that roots fall into natural classes in terms of what templates they can show up in. Which means that they may not show certain alternations. So for example, Rappaport, Hovov, and Levine, 1998, kind of grouped roots into sort of natural semantic classes and had a series of what they called canonical realization rules for which templates they can occur in. Lisa Levinson has proposed type theoretic distinctions between roots that can condition where they show up. Gillian Ramchand has imbued roots with lexical category features that determine their syntactic distribution. So there's an intuition here, but again, there's not much consistency on exactly how that comes about. In terms of how roots control the meaning of templates, we could assume, for example, that templates are polysemous and the root tells you what the meaning of the template should be. So the allosomy analysis of Neil Myler or Jim Wood and Alec Morantz has suggested that that might be possible, and that could control what a given template means. But again, there hasn't been a lot of consistency in exactly how we can account for these root-specific effects. Now, as kind of a bit of personal history, in my own work on argument realization long ago, I've been working on this topic for almost 20 years. I largely abandoned event structures as a part of my theorizing about argument alternations, partly because of the kinds of facts I've outlined here, and partly for other reasons as well. And instead tried to analyze argument alternations in terms of specific correlations between a verb's truth conditional content and its argument realization without having this kind of representational mediation between the two things. And that's essentially where I left it for most of my work on argument realization. The one caveat, of course, is that I've always believed event structures are probably relevant for certain phenomena, but not necessarily for argument realization. However, for the last 5 years or so, I've engaged in a technically independent project with Andrew Kunz-Garboden and various collaborators, where I've returned to event structures and have looked more at the sort of fundamental underpinnings of the ideas of event structures, and specifically the question of what exactly is a root and what is a template, and how do those meanings come together to make the larger event structural meaning that defines the meanings of verbs. And one of the outgrowths of this work is that we have proposed that there's not really a clean separation, a division of labor between what a root and a template actually contributes to the larger event structure. The sort of clean analysis is that, well, the template tells you how the event unfolds and the root just fills in a few details. It doesn't really seem to hold in a lot of cases. Rather, it seems the root actually does a lot of that sort of broad templatic meaning all on its own, meaning that roots and templates often overlap in meaning. That overlap, in turn, therefore, has to be regulated somehow through otherwise regular compositional processes. But what it means then is that sometimes a root can subsume the meaning of a template or vice versa. It means that sometimes a root and a template can have partly overlapping meanings, but then they augment one another. In some cases, they may have incompatible meanings. And crucially, those kinds of meaning relationships between a root and a template could, in principle, give rise to root sensitivity effects when the two push each other in different directions or possibly form some kind of incompatibility without having to posit any additional classification of roots or any additional realization rules or anything like that. In our 2020 book that I wrote with Andrew Kunz-Garboden, we specifically looked at dative alternations and suggested that this kind of analysis actually can give rise to a lot of the effects that I've outlined here. Okay. Now, an issue with our study on dative alternations, though, is that the indirect object frame in English and the dative alternation in general, I mean, it's not entirely productive. I mean, you get it with many verbs, but there's some verbs you don't get it with. And it could be that there's just a high degree of lexicalization going on. So you might ask the question, do we really need a very general theory of these effects? Could it just sort of arise from some just lexicalization effects? For this reason, in conjunction with Kyle Giroux at the University of Essex, we've been embarked also on a project of looking at dative alternations in a language where the processes for deriving it are much more productive, to kind of see what kind of general theory would account for that kind of a system. And we've been looking at Kinyarwanda, which is a Bantu language spoken in Rwanda, where the dative alternation, or the closest equivalent to a dative alternation, arises through applicativization. In particular, for monotransitive verb like in 9a, a verb meaning throw that takes a subject and an object, and in 9a means Nkusi threw the ball. Applying an applicative morpheme ir to the verb licenses an additional object on top of the other two that is the recipient for the event, giving us something like 9b, Nkusi threw Kanam out of the ball. Crucially, this applicativization process is actually much more widely applicable. Many verbs can show it. It also shows a tremendously greater variety of root sensitivity effects than we see in dative alternations in English. And yet at the same time, there's quite a bit of systematicity and regularity there that we think sort of argues for the kind of general theory of overlapping root and template meaning that we're advocating for. So what I want to do in this talk is first briefly outline our analysis of English and the framework of analysis that we're using, and then go through the Kinyarwanda data and kind of look at the patterns there and show that this provides evidence for a kind of root template interaction, if you think event structures are part of verb meanings, that's indicative of this need to have root and template meanings overlapping, and that may provide a way of analyzing root sensitivity. Okay. Now, I want to make one final comment before I go on. The framework of analysis I'll use here for dative alternations will begin with Harley's analysis that assumes that event structures are phrase structures. However, this isn't the only way to analyze event structures. They can be analyzed in numerous different ways. I'm choosing this one because it provides a very nice way to give a compositional semantics. But my point isn't about syntactic event structures or really any other particular framework of event structures. It's about the fundamental concept of root versus templates and how you put those things together, regardless of how you formalize it. Okay, so I'll start with the English dative alternation quickly, just to get the framework of analysis out. If you look across all of the examples we had before, what seems clear is that the templates don't mean what you would expect from two. Their meanings are much weaker than that. The indirect object template seems to mean basically cause perspective possession. That's the strongest meaning you can associate with it. The meaning of the two template is a little bit more complicated. It could either be possession or it could be arrival. Cause possession or caused arrival, but either one is perspective. So it's very weak. Cause perspective possession or perspective arrival. Okay. So I'll start by quickly analyzing the prospectivity effect. And I'll follow work going back to at least Kernighan-Davis 2001 and assume that that follows from some kind of sublexical modality. The result obtains at some other worlds, not necessarily the real world. More specifically, following kind of a lot of recent work on non-culmination in languages where result states can be canceled, I'll assume that the modal is a kind of necessity modal that says that the result obtains in some defined set of worlds. I'll call that set of worlds B, that's the modal base. I don't myself have a good sense of what the modal base is for ditransitives, but there's just some set of worlds that the result obtains in that may include the real world, but may not include the real world, or whatever the reference world is, so that you could get that the result obtained, but not necessarily. Okay. And furthermore, that's part of the causal head. And so the definition of the causal head is given in 11. I am going to give a lot of compositional details in this talk, but if that's not your cup of tea, don't worry. I'll try to explain everything in very plain language. But what 11 says basically is that there's a result state, there's an agent, and the agent does something that possibly causes the result state to happen. And that's all 11 says. What are the result states? Following a 2011 paper of mine on ditransitive verbs, I'll make a distinction between two major types of result states. For most change of state verbs like break or crack or cut or kill or something, the result state is usually just monadic. It's just a property obtains of the patient that didn't obtain before. So broken would be an example of that. But for ditransitive verbs, the result states are inherently dyadic. It's relating the patient to another entity. It's either a having relation or it's a being at relation. So those will be the two relations that'll be of main interest to us, which means the state of heads, and this is now turning to 13, can be defined in terms of these relations. The have head basically just takes two arguments and says one has the other. The two frame, of course, is more general. It's either having or receiving. Now, in the 2011 paper I wrote, I had a way of deriving that concept from a typology of scales, assuming a scalar analysis of change. Here, I'll just do it disjunctively. I'll just call the meaning here an R prime state. And an R prime state holds if either a having or a receiving, or being located at holds. Okay, so that's the meaning of the heading 13b. Okay, beyond that, the question is, what does a manner root do? Well, we agree it names a manner that the causation depends on. But the key additional thing we're going to propose is that in addition to saying how the causation came about, roots can also say something about the theme and the recipient or goal of the state as well. They can overlay additional information on top of that state about those entities. Okay. Now, if you go back and look at the trees in 2, you'll probably notice there's a little bit of a problem here. The root's really high in the tree, but those two noun phrases are really low in the tree, and they've kind of already been picked up as arguments. So how does the thing up here say something about the things down here? Well, it's not that difficult to imagine how. The manner root will have access to the entire state. And having access to the state, it can say for whatever the theme of that state is, or for whatever the recipient or goal of that state is, I want to say these additional things. So I've defined in 14 a couple of functions. TH prime takes a state and says, give me the theme back. And RG prime takes a state and says, give me the recipient back or give me the goal back. And then it can say things about them. So the meaning of a root is just what's in 15 for some manner M prime and some extra stuff Q prime. M prime applies to the causing and the Q prime applies to whatever the theme and the recipient goal are. The rule that puts together a causal head with a root is what's given in 16. It just basically applies all the same arguments to them and conjoins their meaning. It's everything that the causal head says and everything that the root says. So it's kind of this complex bundle of how the causation happened and something about what the result might be. If you go through and put together all of the pieces that we have, the meanings for the two templates, as I discussed in 10, emerge as in 17 when you add the root into them. Basically, the indirect object frame says there's some agent X that possibly causes a having by virtue of some manner. Oh, and also some other things may hold about the theme and the recipient. And then the two template says the agent causes a possible R prime relationship by some manner M prime. Oh, and some other information may hold between the theme and whatever the recipient or goal is. And that's all the templates say. At this point, the question is, what do roots mean such that they would give rise to root sensitivity effects? I'll just give a couple quick examples and then I'll move on to illustrate the framework, and then we'll move on to Kinyarwanda. For the give root, if you think about the fundamental meaning of give, what it seems to be representing is just that there actually had to be possession there. That runs across all uses of give. So in that case, perhaps the meaning is just that there's some giving manner, but also the result obtains not just at this set of worlds B prime, but the set of worlds B prime with the condition that the real world actually be a part of it. That would ensure that it actually happens. And that's all that 18 represents. Actual having and also a giving manner. I should add also here that I'm representing this as two separate components of the root of give. I'm not actually sure that's the case. I don't really know how to define what giving actions or giving customs or giving manners are, but I have a feeling that whatever they are, probably the possession actually follows from the nature of what we call giving actions and not as a separate condition. But I'll represent them separately here just so it's easy to see what's going on. Okay. So if you put that into the template for something like Mary gave John the book, and now I'm turning to example 19 on the handout, the composed meaning is Mary possibly caused John to have the book and actually caused John to have the book by some giving. But in this context, the actual having subsumes the meaning of possible having. Actual having entails possible having. So really, the meaning is truth conditionally equivalent to the simplified form in 20. Mary caused John to actually have the book by virtue of giving, whatever giving is. The key here is that the root subsumes essentially the entire meaning of the template. Furthermore, if you take the same root and put it into the to frame, exactly the same thing happens. The composed meaning is that Mary gave a book to John, is that Mary possibly caused an R prime relation between John and the book, and actually caused John to have the book by giving. But of course, actual having entails possible R prime. So once again, it all simplifies to simply Mary caused John to actually have the book by giving. So the meanings are synonymous, and it's because the give root subsumes the meaning of the indirect object template, which subsumes the meaning of the to template. So give is so strong it obliterates any semantic distinction between them because actual possession is in its meaning. On the other hand, if you have a root that doesn't have possession in the meaning, this won't happen. So throw, for example, if given a description of throw in 22, requires the agent to actually not have or not have a theme be added anymore. And possibly that the theme arrive at whatever the named goal or recipient is by virtue of some type of ballistic motion that is what throwing is, but it doesn't have possession in its meaning. Now, if you put it in the indirect object frame, possession will come into the meaning because the indirect object frame has that, but not the to frame. So the two variants will end up not being synonymous, and that gives us root sensitivity. I don't have the details on the handout, but we think this analysis can also explain why carry doesn't sound as good in the indirect object frame. Our claim in the 2020 book was that the manner of carry is such that the agent has to have a certain kind of possession of the theme throughout the entire event. And that's just kind of a little incompatible with like giving the possession to someone else at the end of the event, which the indirect object frame might bring to bear. And so it requires a particular context to get it. Anyway, the larger point is this overlap or potential for overlap in root and template meaning can sort of force a wider range of interpretations, giving rise to root sensitivity. But again, you know, it's fairly limited what what roots actually show the date of alternation in English. So I want to turn now to Kinyarwanda, where there's a much more productive process here that I think really gives a lot more insight into what root and template meanings are really doing in argument alternations. So turn the page to section 3. Okay, first of all, just to recap, in 23a, a verb like throw, for example, can take a subject and a patient, but only if you add an applicative to it does it also take a recipient. That's illustrated again in 23a. Now, before we move on, though, I do want to make at least a brief argument that the applicative object construction and the indirect object construction are actually subject to an apples-to-apples comparison. They could be completely different from one another, but it turns out they have enough semantic and syntactic similarities that we should want to compare them to one another. So first of all, just like you get a London office effect with indirect objects in English, you also get a similar effect in Kinyarwanda. If I try to make the applied object be inanimate, you get the exact same oddity. So that's shown in 23b. Nkusi threw the ball to Kigali, or is throwing the ball to Kigali. Sounds odd. You want Kigali to be the Kigali office here. So you get that same effect. You have to have some kind of animate applied object. Second, that structural asymmetry of binding obtains in exactly the same way in Kinyarwanda. The applied object can bind into the thematic object, but not conversely. Word order is more variable here, but that doesn't change the fact that that's the only binding relationship you can get. And the data for that are given in 24. I want to point out as kind of a side note here, this is actually kind of interesting. Work on Kinyarwanda going back for 40 years has demonstrated quite well that it's a fairly symmetric object language. If you have two objects, you can usually do all the same objecty things. But this is one rare case of just complete asymmetry between the two. But the fact that we have this alignment here suggests that applied objects are similar to indirect objects. We might want to make an apples to apples comparison of them. The Kinyarwanda roots that'll be of interest to us are the ones given in 25. 25a are just regular change of state verbs, which also allow the applicative. So property change verbs like break, and I'll have examples of that in a minute. And then B through H are a variety of the kinds of roots that tend to give rise to cause possession type readings, ditransitive type roots, which will of course be of interest to us here. These include inherent acts of giving, like verbs meaning give and hand and serve, sending verbs, ballistic motion, verbs that like bring and take, future having like bequeath or leave, and things like that. Okay. So now I'll go over some of the root sensitivity effects that we see with the Kinyarwanda applicative constructions. I'll start by looking at verbs when they have the applicative morpheme and license an applied object, but then I'm going to look at the monotransitive variants as well. And then I'll turn to yet another verb class that'll be of interest to us here. Okay, first and foremost, the applicative construction can occur with a much wider range of verbs than just those indicating possession. In fact, pretty much any change of state verb that's transitive can take this applicative. That's shown in 26a. So Mukamana broke the cup does not normally license a second object. It's just a monotransitive. But with the applicative ira on it, it can license an additional argument. However, crucially, that argument is not a recipient. It is instead a beneficiary. So Mukamana broke the cup on behalf of Karamera, not broke the cup and Karamera ended up owning or possessing the cup. It's a beneficiary reading. The cases where you can get a recipient reading are essentially restricted to the roots in 25b through h. Things like throw and serve, for example, and that's illustrated in 27a and b. These verbs normally do not allow a second object, but when you put the applicative on there, you can get it, and the reading can be that it's a recipient, not a beneficiary. Now, caveat here, you can also get a beneficiary reading, so it's actually ambiguous between the two. 26b is not ambiguous, it's just a beneficiary, and that's it. Okay. Now, there's a problem here, of course. I haven't really justified that recipient and beneficiary are two distinct thematic roles. You might think that, well, receiving is a type of benefiting, perhaps. So maybe those are two essentially should be conflated together. There's no ambiguity. It's just, what's the space of beneficiaries. However, I think there's reason to think that that's probably not true, that there really is a distinction between these two concepts. So to give an illustration of this, consider the data in 29. This is with a regular property change verb, which we're claiming licenses a beneficiary role, not a recipient. If you set up the context just right, though, you can really clarify that the result state, the role that the applied object have is definitely benefiting with not an ounce of receiving in it. So here's the situation. Imagine Nkusi. Poor Nkusi is bedridden. He's been sick for a while. So he's just sitting in bed while he's convalescing. And he desperately wants to see a nice view out his window. Maybe there's some nice mountains outside the window. But unfortunately, there's this tree in the way, so his view is obscured. So Karamera graciously agrees to cut down the tree and get rid of it so that Nkusi can see the view. In that case, it's perfectly fine to have an applied object construction. Karamera cut the tree on behalf of Nkusi, with Nkusi as the applied object. And here it's very clear in context, there is no receiving going on. Nkusi benefits from the overall event, but does not actually receive the patient. So that have relation between them just doesn't have to be here. 29b kind of illustrates a similar example. Here it's a malefactive rather than benefactive reading, but it's the same idea. There's no necessary receiving. Now, on the other hand, if you take one of these cause possession type roots, the ones that we say allow recipient readings, you can define context where it's clear that there's a receiving, but where it's not at all obvious there's any kind of benefiting. So imagine the example in 30a. Suppose that I wanted to give Nkusi a mango, but he's too far away, so I can't throw it to him. So instead I throw it to Habimana, who then goes on and throws it to Nkusi so that he can eat the mango. In this case, we have Habimana as the applied object. And here, there's not any obvious sense in which Habimana benefits from the event. Habimana is a receiver, but not necessarily a benefitter. So here we have receiving without benefiting. 30b illustrates that you can have something similar with the verb for send, but it's the same basic idea here. So I think there's reasons to think that benefiting and receiving should be kept separate from one another. They don't have to go hand in hand. You get receiving with one class of roots, benefiting with another class. There's root sensitivity in the very basic interpretation of the applied object construction. Okay, now having said that, let's turn to what these verbs mean when you don't have an applied object. First of all, when you don't have an applied object, it's not always possible to express that there is a goal or a recipient necessarily in the event. It turns out, as my collaborator Kyle has shown in his work, that it's actually kind of verb specific, whether you can even express that there's something else there. So there isn't sort of a clean to equivalent here. The push verb and the throw verb allow an expression of that additional participant, but for example, send doesn't. But regardless of that syntactic fact, what is true is that the roots that license recipient readings with applied objects, when they don't have the applied object, nonetheless consistently give rise to interpretations that there is a third entity in the event. It's just not being expressed. And that's shown in 32. Nkusi threw the ball, but Nkusi still has it. It's contradictory. There's an expectation that from throwing, the ball will be somewhere else. So there is some other entity involved that is the ultimate location of the ball, whatever that is. Similarly with send, there has to be a releasing. The gift will end up somewhere else. Okay, so it's contradictory to deny that that happened. Even more interestingly, though, whether that implicit third participant is a recipient or whether it's a goal depends on the particular verb. So with the verb meaning serve in Kinyarwanda, the inference is that it has to be a recipient. What this verb basically describes is a situation where you're providing food to someone for their consumption. Okay. And to illustrate that, if you set up a context where, let's say that Karemera is making a cake, and the goal is simply to display the cake for a competition. So imagine like a really sad episode of the Great British Baking Show where Paul and Mary don't actually eat the cake, they just look at it. In that particular context, Karemera serve the cake is infelicitous. A more appropriate description would be place the cake on the table or display the cake or something like that. But the serving verb implies that it's actually being given to someone for consumption. So there's a receiving notion there. Conversely, send doesn't require receiving, but it does require that there be some kind of a goal. So imagine a context where Habimana is a spy and is trying to get a microphone into a particular room. So mails a letter that ends up in that room. There's no particular recipient. In fact, quite the opposite. You don't want the microphone to be received by anybody. You want it to be covertly there. And in that case, you can get Habimana sent the letter in that context. So roots differ in terms of whether the implicit argument is a recipient or whether it's a location. On the other hand, with property change verbs like break, there is no inference, I think at all, that there's an additional third participant. There doesn't have to be some beneficiary out there in the world. Things can just be broken. Okay. So roots differ in whether there's an implicit third participant or not, and furthermore in what the role of that participant is. Okay. In 4.3, I'll just kind of briefly cover this. There's also root-specific entailments of change. It turns out that kind of non-culmination effect where you can cancel receiving and arriving is pretty common. Monotransitive or an applied object variance, it's usually the case that you can deny that the theme arrived at a particular place or that somebody actually received the theme. That's shown for send and throw in 35 and 36. But if you turn the page to 37 and 38, it's also sometimes the case that even if receiving or arriving is not entailed, the agent has to lose the theme. And that's shown in 37 for the send verb. And you can't really go on and deny that the agent lost the theme in that case. Again, though, that's root contingent. So for the verb that means bring in Kinyarwanda, Nkusi brought the little basket, or brought the little basket to Karemera, but Nkusi still has it. There, actually, you don't have to have a loss relation. So again, exactly what does occur in the event seems to be determined by the root. The specific template doesn't really say one way or the other what actually has to be the outcome. Okay. So again, a variety of types of change seem to follow from the meanings of the roots. They're not really coming from the template. You have to know on a root by root basis what the interpretation is. Okay, now before we turn to an analysis of these facts, there's another very interesting verb class in Kinyarwanda I want to discuss, which is a very small class of verbs. I actually think it's only a very, very small class of maybe 4 or 5. I'm not really sure how many there are, that license two objects without an applicative. So I'll call these lexical ditransitives, and I'll call that additional argument an indirect object instead of an applied object. But they can actually have 2 arguments and there's no applicative morpheme. 2 examples are given in 39A and B. There's a verb that basically means give. I gave Nkusi the book. And here we have a recipient interpretation of that additional argument, and there is no applicative morpheme. The verb for leave takes a goal indirect object. And again, there's no applicative there. Nkusi left a book in Kigali. Now, it turns out that indirect objects are pretty similar to applied objects in several respects. With at least the give verb and the hand verb and maybe a couple of others, you get a Kigali office effect, and that's shown in 48. Nkusi gave Kigali the letter is odd unless Kigali stands in for a group of a group of people. And the same for the hand verb, although this isn't consistent. So the leave verb in 39b does not give rise to a Kigali office effect. And we also get the same kinds of binding asymmetries. The indirect object can bind into the thematic object, but not conversely. So there again is something very similar to applied objects here as well. So an apples to apples comparison is probably warranted. But there's an interesting root sensitivity effect that happens with ditransitives. If you do put the applicative morpheme onto one of those verbs, what happens depends on the particular root. With the give root, when you put the applicative morpheme on there, it adds another argument, kind of like you would expect applicative would, and that produces potentially a tritransitive structure. The applied object is the beneficiary, the indirect object is the recipient, and the thematic object is the patient. I gave Habimana the book Born-Nkusi, is what 42a means. Now, on the other hand, when you take the leave verb and you put the applicative on there, it does not increase the valence of the verb. Rather, the goal takes on a recipient interpretation. Nkusi gave Gatete a book. Now, Gatete is still a goal here in a sense. The book does arrive in a sense, but now Gatete is in particular interpreted as a recipient as well. So in one case, you add an argument to the verb. In the other case, you just convert the thematic roles of the current arguments and otherwise don't change anything grammatically. Okay. So again, we're getting this kind of root contingent, root sensitivity effect here. And then finally, just a comment, with lexical ditransitives, there's also a considerable amount of root control over the result state. With give in hand, you have to actually have possession at the new possession at the end of the event. With leave, that isn't required. Loss, whether you actually lose, the agent actually loses something as part of the event, again, depends on the verb. With hand, that is actually the case, so that's shown in 44a. But with the verb that means bequeath, like an inheritance or a trust, that doesn't require any actual possession. So once again, a lot of root sensitivity in what the actual result state is. Okay, so what I want to do now, having kind of gone over this kind of myriad of facts about the Kinyarwanda ditransitives and the applicative object structures, let me quickly summarize what we've seen and try to kind of give the high level picture and then talk about how an understanding of roots as contributing templatic information can explain a lot of this with really not much other additional machinery. So what we've seen is basically 5 root classes in Kinyarwanda. There's the give class. The root type is lexically ditransitive. It takes 2 arguments without any applicative. The third participant, the one that isn't the patient or the agent, is a recipient. And when you put an applicative on there, you get a beneficiary applied object that is distinct from the indirect object. And then there's the leave type ditransitive. It can take 2 objects without an applicative. The indirect object is a goal. And when you applicativize it, the indirect object becomes a recipient applied object. And then there's 2 types of monotransitives, serve and throw, each of which basically only allows 1 object. With serve, there's an unexpressed additional recipient. And when you applicativize it, all that happens is that recipient gets realized. With throw, you have an unexpressed goal. And what happens is the goal gets realized under applicativization, but also becomes a recipient. And then we have monotransitives like break. There is no implication of a third participant. And when you add the applied object, it's a beneficiary. The meanings of the templates, therefore, are really very general. The applied object template is caused, possible, receiving, or benefiting. The indirect object template is cause, possible, receiving, or possible, arriving. And then the monotransitive template for property change verbs is just a cause, possible, change of state. Okay. All of the other details are coming from the roots. So what's the analysis going to be? Well, for the 2 different types of monotransitives, we'll assume the analyses in 47a and b. For the property change verbs like break, we'll just assume kind of a standard change of state analysis. The root names the state and applies to the patient, and then that was caused to come about. And the state is just some monadic state. A new property obtains for the patient, like in 48a. For the monotransitives that have that implicit additional participant, we'll assume once again that the root is fundamentally defining the manner of action. And so the result state, whatever it is coming from some functional element, which we'll call a preposition again kind of following Harley's analysis. But the difference is that the preposition is syntactically monadic. It only takes 1 syntactic argument, and that's what's illustrated in 47d. But there's 2 interpretively. So what we're going to claim is that that preposition takes one argument and says that it stands in an R prime relation with some implicit existentially bound additional participant that is not expressed, but it is part of the truth conditional content. On the surface, this will look like a monotransitive, but the semantics is such that there's an additional participant. Now, here we just need to know what the meanings of the roots are. And for the 47b type structure, where we have that implicit additional participant, the two types of roots we're interested in here are the serve type and the throw type. And the big difference between them is that the serve type says that whatever that additional third participant is, it has to be a recipient. There's an actual or possible having relationship that comes from the nature of serving. With the throw root, on the other hand, it says that there's an additional participant that is potentially where something arrives at. So you get essentially a goal reading for whatever that third participant is. So by picking up on the participants in the state, it can say it's a recipient or it's a goal. Plus it could define whatever else we need, particular manners, the fact that the agent loses possession of the theme, etc. Now, if you compose everything together and do all the right substitutions and eliminate redundant conjunctions, etc., the meaning you get for I broke the cup, I threw a cup, or I served a cup, all the surface monotransitive forms is what's given in 50. I broke the cup is I potentially caused the cup to be broken. I served the cup like it's a cup of tea is I potentially caused some group of people to have a cup of tea by serving. And with throw, it's I definitely caused myself to lose the cup and possibly caused it to arrive at some other participant. Okay. So now the question is, what does the applicative do? Well, one thing it does is realize recipients. So it introduces a have relation, but in other cases, it realizes a beneficiary. So we need to have some notion of what benefiting is. What I'll assume about benefiting is that whatever it is, truth conditionally, whatever it is, it essentially relates a particular participant to a result state and says that that participant benefits from that state. This has the effect, if we assume that it can apply to really any state that anybody can benefit from, it has the effect of converting any monadic state into a dyadic state by adding a beneficiary. Since the applicative either does benefiting or having, I'll assume that the actual meaning of the applicative is some relation B prime, which I've defined in 52, which is true if you've either come to have something or come to benefit from the state. And the intuition here is it's basically kind of like the animate sort of possessor, benefit, or additional participant you might have in a dyadic state. And then we'll assume that the applicative applies as a kind of low applicative as proposed by Kyle Giroux in his 2016B work. So that the structure we get is what's in 53A. It's basically the monotransitive structure, but now the applicative is sitting above the dyadic state defining head. And all it does semantically is it just says, in addition to everything else, there's also a B prime relation, either benefiting or having of whatever that express entity is. So in this tree, that would be Nkusi. So given that, if you take the examples in 50 and look at the applied object variance with Nkusi as the applied object, the meanings you get in 54A through C, I broke a cup for Nkusi, I threw or served Nkusi a cup, or I threw or served a cup to someone on Nkusi's behalf, essentially have the logical representations in 54A through C. It's exactly the same as before. I broke something and Nkusi is in a B prime relation. I served something and Nkusi has a B prime thematic role. Or I threw something and Nkusi has a B prime thematic role. The question here is, how do we resolve to these specific interpretations we get on a root by root basis? And it turns out that an interaction of what the root says, what the rest of the template says, and what the applicative morpheme says will conspire to produce exactly the set of readings that we anticipated. In the case of 54A, the inherent state of brokenness is a monadic state. So saying that there's an additional participant there, a B prime participant, results only in a beneficiary reading, because a recipient reading would have to be part of the meaning of the state anyway. Monadic states don't have recipients, so the only possible interpretation of B prime is benefiting. That ensures that property change verbs only get beneficiary readings. They don't have the right kinds of states to license a recipient. With the other two verbs, throw and serve, here there's already an implicit third participant. So the question is, what is the relationship of Nkusi, the applied object, to that implicit participant? One possibility is that they're interpreted as distinct entities. Well, since the implicit participant is a recipient or a goal, that role can't be Nakusi's role, leaving only benefiting. Possession would be a possible outcome, but benefiting, it's sort of already used up. So benefiting is the only possible relation, giving us this beneficiary type reading. However, if Nkusi is conflated with that additional participant, so they're interpreted as the same entity, now more interesting things happen. With the serb verb, that additional entity is already a recipient. That's what the root says. And the applicative morpheme says that it's a B prime. But recipient is one of the possible interpretations of B prime. So in a sense, the B prime meaning is already there, meaning the applicative's thematic contribution is redundant. The result then is that a recipient that was implicit in the meaning simply becomes overt. So in sort of an intuitive sense, the applicative isn't adding anything, it's just drawing out meaning that was already there. With the throw case, on the other hand, this participant is a goal. And now we're finding out that it's also a B prime. But if it's an animate type thing and it's a goal, it's going to end up having something with it and also being animate, which is kind of the basic definition of at least some type of alienable or control type possession in the sense of Xiaowei Tom. That should in principle satisfy the conditions for being a recipient. When you sort of have things with you, there's a sense in which you possess them. In which case it's going to move the interpretation of the goal into being a recipient. It's still a goal, but now it's also a recipient as well. So depending on how the applied object is interpreted, what kind of state the root defines, what kind of participants are in those states, you get all these different possible readings just through the compositional interaction of these different pieces. And it could be a wholly new beneficiary, an implicit recipient, or just converting a thematic role to something else. Okay. Let me quickly go over lexical ditransitives, and then I'll make a few comments at the end, and then I'll stop. Lexical ditransitives, of course, are a unique case. They take two objects without anything. No applicative is necessary. Now, the fact that they do this, I honestly don't have a great explanation for. This is actually a case where I'm going to appeal to some kind of lexicalization. Maybe it's a syntactic feature a la Jillian Ramchan, but somehow they have a feature that says, gotta have two objects. And for whatever reason, they license double object construction without an applicative. For this, we'll just assume it's the P lockhead that we were assuming otherwise. And that in principle, you can get that P lockhead with just a limited class of roots, and that would give a structure like what's in 55. The question then is, what does the root contribute when it's a lexical ditransitive? Well, unsurprisingly, it just says more things about the participants. The give root in 56 just says an actual having occurs. And the leave root just says that there's an actual loss of possession, but also a possible arriving at whatever that additional participant is. And that's all 56A and B says. So when you put those into the templates, you get kind of what you'd expect, a give meaning and a leave type meaning, with the understanding you can cancel the actual leaving at the particular location. That's it. But here's the deal. If these roots require two objects, in principle, you don't have to use the bare double object structure. You could instead use an applicative plus our monadic p head. That creates a double object structure. That would be just to take the PP of 55, or so the applicative head of 53A and substitute it for the PP in 55. Okay. And that's illustrated in the tree in 58A. Now, if you were to do that for the leave verb, what would happen grammatically is that the verb would still get two objects, which is fine. But what would happen semantically is exactly the same thing that happened with throw. By saying that there's a B prime participant, knowing that that thing is also a goal, and there's an R prime relationship together, will conspire to convert that entity that would otherwise have just been interpreted as a goal instead as a recipient. Because it would have to both have been a B prime relation and also be a goal. An animate goal would resolve to something like a recipient, giving rise to this additional conversion effect where applicativization turns a goal into a recipient. It's just because it's two different ways to give that verb two different noun phrases, and it results in these two different readings. But if we try to do the same thing with give, so to do the same structure in 58A, but with the give root, something interesting would happen. The meaning that would come out, because give already says that there's a recipient in the interpretation, the meaning that would come out by putting the applicative on there is exactly the same interpretation. It would end up being synonymous because the applicative says you have a B prime role, but it's already a recipient because of the root. So you would have a synonymous alternation. Well, in Kyle's work on Kinyarwanda, one thing he's noted about applicatives in Kinyarwanda is synonymy is not something that they do. This is a applicativization output constraint. When you put an applicative, there's an expectation that there should be some truth conditional difference between the two. It's a way of augmenting or upgrading or otherwise changing the interpretation. Based on this independent principle, we wouldn't expect to be able to get the applicative with just a ditransitive structure with the give verb. The only way to compose it in there would be to put it on top of everything else, and that's what's shown in 60. And here you end up with a tritransitive structure. And because every participant is named, there won't be any conflation, and you'll end up getting all three thematic roles. So again, it's a root-specific effect. Here it interacts with independent argument realization principles of Kinyarwanda, but again, because of what the root means, this is going to be the output. Okay. Another type of root sensitivity. Okay, so let me conclude, and then I'll turn it to questions. As I said at the beginning, in argument alternations, the interpretation of a template on an event structural approach, and whether you even get the alternation or not, seem to be constrained by the root. So we need a theory of how that actually happens. And what I'm claiming here is that a theory where roots and templates overlap in their meaning, something not necessarily accepted in all event structural approaches, but which in my recent work I've suggested seems to be the case for many different classes of roots, actually produces exactly this kind of effect without having to define other types of root classes necessarily, or certain types of principles that relate event event templates to roots. Sometimes root subsumption of templatic meaning can obliterate distinctions in alternations. Incompatibilities may prevent certain roots from showing up in certain templates, possibly subject to language particular conditions as well, which would partially derive that. Okay. Now, I've sort of argued that this needs to be a part of a general theory of not just event structures, but specifically argument realization here, mainly using ditransitive verbs, but I do think there's reason to think that this would apply to really any type of alternation that you want to look at. For example, in my 2010 paper on direct oblique alternations, where say an object can alternate with a prepositional phrase or some semantically case-marked DP, I looked at a range of alternations, locative, conative, and a few others, and suggested that the real distinction in the alternation is often just one of thematic role specificity. The direct object has a strictly stronger thematic role than the corresponding oblique expression. Now, I stated that as sort of a verb-by-verb condition. It's like a paradigmatic contrast on verbs, but we could also say that that specificity contrast is fundamentally the function of the templates, and the job of the root is only to overlay what the stronger thematic role is from which you can derive what the weaker thematic role is. In Andrew Kunz-Garboden's work on reflexive marking of anticausatives, he's claimed that the lexical semantics of particular verbs interacts with that operation to produce different interpretations. Again, wasn't assuming event structures, but if we assume that the causative alternation is represented through some event structural distinction, which is very, very common, it's one of the oldest applications of this analysis, on the assumption that roots can contribute different meanings that interact with that, you can derive similar effects. That's assuming reflexivization, of course, is the right analysis. You know, there's been some works, for example, Schaefer and Vivanco, 2016, which has argued against that. But whatever the actual relation is, if it can interact in the right ways with root meanings, you'll get that. And then finally, I'll just sort of add, I'm not expecting every fact about argument alternations can be resolved just through saying the root means this, the template means this, and compositional processes will sort of make all the complexities come out. In my work on middle alternations, basically different types of detransitivization, more broad than anticausatives, I will say that I'm fairly skeptical that everything can be accounted for in exactly that way. And there probably is quite a deal of lexical stipulation going on. So I think there's probably room for that as well. But I think sort of a more careful look at what roots can mean and how they compose together can derive a lot of these sort of core facts about argument alternations sort of directly with the same processes that we would use just to give rise to verb meanings anyway. Okay, I should stop there. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Professor Beavers, for your lecture. And now we have time for questions. First of all, I was wondering about the give verbs in English. In the beginning of your talk, you said that give verbs in both forms, I, O, and the two forms, they entail actual possession, okay?
Yeah.
Okay, but different from through verbs. But I was wondering, because in Brazilian Portuguese, we can say something like, eu dei meu livro para Maria, eu dei meus livros para Maria, mas ela nunca recebeu. I gave my books to Mary, but she never received it.
Yeah.
She never received it then. In English, is that okay?
Not, I find that contradictory, or at least, yeah, it seems contradictory to me, or at least somehow semantically anomalous. If you found other English speakers who said the opposite, that it was possible, I wouldn't be surprised to find speaker-to-speaker variation, but at least for me, that seems like it's not possible.
Okay, and another question I would like to ask is, because I was wondering if we can think about this kind of root sensitivity as in terms of a fine-grained class of Levin 2010.
Of who 2010?
For example, in Portuguese, we can group through verbs and give verbs in same class, in same template class. But they have some kinds of different meanings, and this is the root sensitivity. So they belong to different fine classes.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, that's kind of what we're claiming here, is that you're going to find, I mean, the saddest way to think about it is that every root is its own class, but that there will be significant classes in terms of how they interact with the templates that they're found in.
Yeah.
And I would expect them to be relatively fine-grained. I mean, when we were looking at this, I mean, I've been working on this for quite a while, and even as far back as when I first started doing it, I mean, there were easily like 6 or 7 what I thought were grammatically significant ditransitive classes for English, and obviously in Kinyarwanda there's even more, and that's just because of what I noticed. And so I have a feeling that you're going to find a lot of very fine-grained classes here, not necessarily all grammatically relevant, but that is what you'll find, and that's fine. And I think a lot of people would accept that should be the case. The caveat being, I guess, how do we ensure that those micro differences between them are somehow cashing out in particular grammatical behaviors, like the different inferences we get, or when you can get applied objects, that kind of thing. And then furthermore, which differences matter? I mean, some differences between verbs may be there, and they may even be fairly robust, but it turns out that, at least for a given language, they just don't, other than how you interpret what's being described, they don't really have any particular grammatical effect. But yes, I mean, essentially what we're kind of proposing is a micro classification of verb meanings, but through the truth conditional content, not any separate classification with any separate realization rules.
Yeah. So we have a question on chat. Taking into consideration that morphemes may play a role in R, how do they relate to template or root meaning?
To morphemes? So for example, the applicative would be an example of that. The way that I think a lot of sort of morphological derivational processes are often thought of in event structural approaches is the overlaying of additional event structural meaning. And work on applicatives in particular has essentially proposed exactly that. You take a verb, and then you put an applicative on it, and you get a wholly new argument. Otherwise, everything's the same. The simplest way to do it would be to say you have an event template, and then you add more template to it. And that is actually kind of what we're saying here, although the problem is that the meaning of the root may already subsume the meaning of the applicative, or there may be some other relationship, so that it doesn't always work out in exactly the same way. Sometimes applicatives don't add arguments, they just convert arguments. Sometimes they add arguments where you wouldn't expect them to, or refuse to do it when you would expect them to. But typically that kind of morphology is just more event structure. Now, it's possible, of course, that some of it is realizational, maybe certain combinations of roots and templates will give rise to certain morphology, and then the same root in the same a different root in the same template won't give rise to that. I mean, if that's the case and there's a good argument for it, I'm not entirely sure what I would say about that morphology. It could be that that's actually a surface level effect, or maybe there's something semantic going on. That would be a different kind of case. But a lot of this is structure building when it comes to argument alternations, and that's how we've been viewing it. But the structure is typically templatic in nature because it's doing more argument structure, and especially in the case of applicatives.
But is there a difference between the meaning of derivational morphemes or other morphemes, such as the C in the causative alternation? Because in Brazilian Portuguese, we have the Mary broke the vase broke, but we have C, vaso se quebrou. There is a difference of
that. That C morpheme in Portuguese and its equivalent in French and Spanish, I think, is one of the most complicated cases because there's been so many different proposals about what exactly it's doing. In some cases, it's actually not really doing anything to the event structure. It's perhaps a pronoun on some people's analyses and other people's analyses. So this was Andrew Koonsgaard-Boden's analysis. It essentially reflects he wasn't using event structures, but it was an argument structure altering operation. It was taking a dyadic input and reducing it in a very particular way. Alternatively, it could be the realization of something that technically isn't really about the event structure, but might be about the expression of the arguments overlaid on top of that. If it was a voice head or something like that. So I think the question on any individual basis is, do you have good arguments that it's one type of thing or another? But if you have a sense that it actually is semantically contributing to how arguments are interpreted or how they're related to one another, then it'll probably be something like what we're saying here about the applicative. So I didn't mention this actually because it was running out of time, but like at the bottom of my conclusion, I did mention voice phenomena. I don't really see as anything to do with anything that I'm talking about here, or at least like passive voice in a language like English, because its effect, as far as I can tell, is purely just to change how things are expressed with like no semantic truth conditional effect. And so the event structure is essentially unaffected. It's not the same kind of thing as the applicative, but it's really, you have to dig into the details here. With the applicative, because of its thematic contribution, I mean, it has to do something like what we're saying. It's templatic in nature. But really, my kind of view of this is that it's all a mess. And you have to look at every individual thing and figure out to get a sense of what it's doing first before you can even ask these questions.
Okay, another question now, just for a clarification. For instance, in example 17, how is possibly derived?
17. Oh, how is it derived? The question was, how is 17 derived?
Yes, how is possibly derived? Yes.
So basically, the idea then is that you have so I'm using, this is like a schematization of the meaning here. So I'm assuming that we have DPs whose meanings are just X, Y, and Z. Take those as constants. And that the P heads first apply to two DPs to produce the state that you would get from 13. And then the meaning of the causal head and the meaning of the root or the conjoined meaning that you would get from 16. So each takes a state, description, an agent, and a causing event. And it's the same set, and you just conjoin their two meanings. And so that will get, by virtue of that meaning, when you compose that with the state, you'll essentially get, there's an agent, there's a possible state, cause state, and then there's whatever information comes from the root. The trick, though, is that what the root wants is whatever the theme and the recipient or goal is of the state. And the iota-based functions in 14 allow that to happen. So what I've done in 17a and b is I've gone ahead and done that substitution. So properly speaking, the composed meaning would actually have, for q prime, a function applied over the state and a function applied over two functions applied over the state as the arguments of q prime. I've gone ahead and substituted the outputs of those functions. So that's how compositionally this would be derived. Trick, though, is that I am assuming uniqueness of participants. So if there's a theme, it's a theme. If there's a recipient, it's the recipient, and that's how that works. But it's just basically functional application plus the rule in 16. Functional application plus the rule in 16, and that's all it is. And that's kind of a key point. We don't want special composition rules. We just want things to follow from how you would put them together if we weren't seeing any of this stuff.
Okay, let me see. We have, actually, I have one more last question. I was thinking about the body part possession and session alternation, like the dog bite the girl's leg and the dog bite the girl on the leg.
Oh, yeah.
In Brazilian Portuguese, like in English, it occurs with verbs that denote contact, a physical contact, but it is more general because it can occur with any kind of argument that denotes a part-whole relationship. Like you can say in Portuguese, the fall broke the edge of the vase, and the fall broke the vase on the edge. What I think is not okay in English. But the question actually is, in Portuguese, this alternation can occur with change of state verbs like broke and open and flatten and crumple, but not with all of them, because we have verbs like value or increase the price or civilize that do not accept this kind of alternation. So to this alternation occur, verbs must denote physical contact. Could be this considered a phenomenon related to root sensitivity?
I would think most definitely. That's a really interesting pattern. I was not aware of that at all, and that is actually really interesting. I mean, it's clear that there's a part-whole relationship, involved in possessor ascension anyway. I believe that's typical. But it looks like the verb class restrictions are quite different. But there is that kind of contact, your physical component to it. One of my suspicions about that is that, and so this, I only briefly touched on this when I mentioned types of result states. Because I mentioned monadic and dyadic result states, but that's just one division in result states. But I've thought for a long time, and I had a 2011 paper on effectiveness that kind of discussed this, is that we really want probably a more fine-grained classification of any kind of monadic or dyadic result states, and depending on the type of scale that's being described. And in work on scalar change, there's usually been a three-way distinction. There's property change, there's change of location, and there's sort of quantity type scales like we get with something like EAT. But that's not going to be enough, right? There's got to be further subdivisions that are sort of increasingly more kind of naturalistic, like intuitive classes of scales. Now, at that point, because the root is the thing for a change of state verb that's actually bringing the scale to bear, I mean, that everybody agrees on that. Then if templates are sensitive to scalar type at that degree of granularity, which would be really interesting because if they're at that level of granularity, then you would expect pretty fine-grained distinctions. Physical contact scales, scales of change that arise from physical contact may be implicated in this class of alternations, and possibly ones to do with certain types of extent might be implicated in these other alternations or something like that. But you need a much more fine-grained classification of state types. And that sounds like the kind of reason to think that may be templatically relevant. So that it raises another interesting question for me too, because this is something we sort of said in the book. So this alternation is actually beautiful because it kind of goes against something that I thought. But roots is where the real idiosyncrasies come from. So that's where you expect the fine-grained distinctions. Templates are supposed to be very general, cause and change. But why couldn't some templates in certain languages be more fine-grained than that? Why not restrict themselves to something maybe a little bit more contentful than that? Okay, I don't know that I can think of a lot of cases where that happens, but this might be exactly an example of that. That would be really, really interesting because the overlap would become more specific.
Yeah. So let me see. We have no other questions. So once again, we thank you very much, Professor Beavers. Certainly the lecture was a great learning experience for all of us. And we invite everyone here to continue watching Abralinha ao Vivo series. And finally, would you like to make some final remarks?
Just to say thank you for listening. I've really appreciated a chance to hear your questions and to have this conversation with all of you. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you for inviting me.
Okay, thank you. So have a nice day, have a nice weekend.
Likewise.
And bye-bye.
Bye.